Welcome to AEIOU, a podcast about Austria. I'm Andrew, your host. At the end of our last episode, I mentioned that the developmentally disabled Emperor Ferdinand of Austria had retreated to an estate in Moravia while the revolution was in full swing in Vienna. Famously, when told a revolution had broken out among the people, Ferdinand had asked Metternich about the masses. Are they allowed to do that? Emperor Ferdinand's flight occurred in May 1848. For much of the summer, the imperial army had its time taken up with putting down the rebellion in Italy. By the fall, it was time for the army to be deployed in Vienna. Radetzky marched into the imperial capital in time for the debut of Johann Strauss's march, written in his honor, which was on August 31st. The emperor returned as well, and attention was then focused on putting down the revolution in Vienna and Prague. Radetzky moved against the rebels in Vienna, while another military leader, Prince Albert of Windisch-Gratz, occupied Prague. Calm returned to both Austria and Bohemia. All was not calm elsewhere, however, particularly in Hungary. As with other European countries in 1848, revolution broke out in Hungary as well. I don't want to spend too much time talking about the process of the Hungarian Revolution before it was squelched by the imperial army, since it's really more a piece of Hungarian history than Austrian history. However, we should give a basic overview of the events. As we discussed in a previous episode, one of the leaders of the revolution in Hungary was Louis Kossuth, a politician and journalist. The Hungarians, or as they call themselves, the Magyars, sought to have their own government based in Pressburg, today known as Bratislava, which is the capital of Slovakia. The response of the imperial government was initially positive, granting to Louis Bathyany the right to form a government as prime minister, with Kossuth as finance minister. However, it soon became clear to Vienna that the Magyars were operating too independently from Vienna. Among Kossuth's reforms was the issuing of Hungary's own currency. Once control was re-established in Vienna, plans were hatched to re-establish control in Pressburg as well. A Croatian military leader, Josip Jelačić, was chosen to lead the assault on the Magyars, with Vienna well aware that relations between the Magyars and the Slavic minorities in Hungary had deteriorated since the revolution began. Kossuth was well informed and raised an army to prepare for war, and this army defeated Jelačić in September. From there, Kossuth's army marched toward Vienna to preempt the attack on Hungary. Meanwhile, in Vienna, part of the Austrian populace expressed its support for the Hungarian Revolution and attacked troops preparing to march to Hungary. Windisch-Gratz and Jelačić put down the rebellion, the last of the revolution for Austria, in Vienna before meeting Kossuth's army south of the city on October 30th. The imperial army was victorious, but the Magyars were still in control, so Windisch-Gratz continued to march toward Hungary. The Hungarian government fled east to Debrecen, today the second largest city in Hungary after Budapest. Realizing that stronger leadership would be necessary in Vienna to finally defeat Hungary, Emperor Ferdinand was finally successfully pressured to abdicate in favor of his nephew Franz Joseph, who acceded to the throne in early December. Among the new emperor's first actions were to rescind all previous concessions made to Hungary. Kossuth was declared an outlaw, and Franz Joseph resolved to destroy him. The imperial army occupied Budapest on January 5, 1849. The Hungarian army raised by Kossuth was spread dangerously thin, trying as it was to establish full Magyar control over the Kingdom of Hungary, including predominantly Romanian Transylvania. However, despite initial setbacks in January and early February, the Hungarian army was able to maintain parity with the imperial army. With its spring campaign, which ended on May 21st, the Hungarian army expelled imperial troops from the Kingdom of Hungary. The new Emperor Franz Joseph had been humiliated. He reached out to the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas I, who agreed to send troops to support the imperial army. By June 5th, Russian troops were also fighting the Hungarians. By August, Kossuth had fled to Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Although some Hungarian units held out until the fall, the revolution was crushed for all intents and purposes by August 13th. Relations between Austria and Hungary had been damaged for the foreseeable future. Hungary itself was subjected to military rule for the next 20 years. We will see in future episodes how that arrangement ended. While the defeat of Hungary is usually viewed as the end of the European revolutions of 1848, there's one final theater that concerned Austria, and that was the German Confederation itself. As we discussed in a previous episode, a Frankfurt Parliament had been convened to carry forth the banner of German nationalism. Remember that nationalism, along with liberalism, was viewed as one of the twin evils plaguing German-speaking Europe in the aftermath of the defeat of Napoleon. For 2 decades it had been kept under wraps to a large extent. Now it was ascendant again. Even as the revolution racked Austria, other German-speaking states saw revolutionary activity. The culmination of this activity came in the form of the Frankfurt Parliament, which was convened for the first time on May 18, 1848. The power struggles of the German Confederation followed the member states into the new parliament, unfortunately, with some delegates favoring Austrian hegemony and others Prussian hegemony. There was also extensive debate over political unification, with the formation of a new German Reich proposed in March 1849. The member states elected the King of Prussia, Frederick William IV, to become Emperor of the Germans. However, King Frederick William refused the crown, privately referring to it as a crown from the gutter that was unfit for a royal person like himself to wear. Within months, both Prussia and Austria were compelling smaller, less powerful states to withdraw from the Frankfurt Parliament. By the summer of 1849, the Frankfurt Parliament was moribund. The following year, supported by Russia once again, Austria was able to reassert its primacy in the German Confederation. As with the other revolutions of 1848, the revolution taking place in Frankfurt failed, but it did set the model for the future unification of Germany. More on that topic in future episodes. For now, we return to Vienna and Emperor Franz Joseph. It would be difficult to overestimate the importance of this man to Austrian history. Only 18 years old when he was crowned, Franz Joseph would lead Austria for nearly 70 years. Among European monarchs, only Louis XIV, Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom, and Prince Johann II of Liechtenstein served longer terms. Serving as long as he did, Franz Joseph was able to dictate to a large extent what the Austrian Empire would look like until it finally disintegrated 2 years after his death. The first few months of Franz Joseph's reign were concerned with defeating Hungary and re-establishing strict rule there. However, he did not limit his imposition of absolute rule only to Hungary. In the so-called March Constitution, promulgated by Interior Minister Count Stadion in 1849, Austrian absolutism was forcefully reasserted. Most of the privileges and rights extended over the previous year were summarily revoked. The constitution was neither submitted to the Hungarian legislature for approval nor even extended to the kingdom. Instead, as noted, Hungary was subjected to military rule. For its own part, Hungary refused to acknowledge Franz Joseph as the King of Hungary. Over the subsequent 4 years, Franz Joseph tightened his grip on Austria more and more. On New Year's Eve 1851, he revoked his own constitution from 2 years earlier and imposed the Sylvester Patent, so called because New Year's Eve is also the feast of St. Sylvester. With this new constitution and upon the death of Felix von Schwarzenberg, the minister-president, equivalent to a prime minister or chancellor, the emperor dispensed with having a government altogether. He instead convened a conference of ministers and appointed Karl Ferdinand von Buol as the chairman of the conference, as well as foreign minister. Despite these appointments, the emperor remained fully in control. The first major challenge of the 1850s came in 1853 when Franz Joseph was subjected to an assassination attempt. Tempers were still hot in Hungary, now into its 4th year under military rule, and the would-be assassin was an angry Hungarian nationalist named János Lebenyi. Lebenyi attempted to stab the emperor in the neck, but the high collar worn by Franz Joseph at the time prevented the wound from being very deep. One of the emperor's entourage, Count Maximilian Karl Lamoral O'Donnell, subdued Lebenyi with his saber. O'Donnell was already a member of the Irish nobility, as his surname indicated, but he was also made an Austrian noble as a result of his service to Franz Joseph on that day. Lebenyi was tried for regicide, sentenced to death, and executed a mere 8 days after the incident. The second major challenge was a war, this time the Crimean War. This war, ostensibly fought over Russia's extension of its influence into the Balkans, as Ottoman power was in decline, saw France and the United Kingdom siding with the Turks against Russia. The Western European powers sought to retain power for Western Christianity in Ottoman Palestine, while Russia sought to assert the power of the Orthodox Church in the Holy Land. Ultimately, after 2.5 years, Russia was defeated and ceded territory in the Balkans to what would eventually become the Kingdom of Romania. In the case of the Crimean War, Austria suffered a loss of standing because it did not enter the war. On the one hand, it might have made sense for Austria to fight on the side of the UK and France. After all, with France now once again under Bonaparte rule, Austria was the standard bearer for the Roman Catholic Church in Europe. On the other hand, Russia had helped to preserve Habsburg rule over Hungary. In the end, Austria played the role of negotiator, with the result of a Russian defeat damaging Russian-Austrian relations. The real defeat for Austria ended up being diplomatic. It found itself in 1856 virtually without allies. Britain and France sought to limit Austria's future influence in the Balkans and Italy, while Russia's subsequent coldness toward Austria meant that Prussia could begin again to push Austria around in Central Europe. Within a couple of years, another war for Italian independence from Austria would break out, and this time the French would support Italy rather than Austria. In this second war of Italian independence, the war would be much shorter, and the Italians would be victorious. Within 3 months, Piedmont Sardinia defeated Austria and annexed most of its Italian possessions. A peace treaty signed in Zurich, Switzerland, that fall ended Habsburg rule on the Italian peninsula, with the exception of Veneto, its capital of Venice, and South Tyrol, where German was spoken then and is still spoken by a minority today. Franz Joseph had suffered the worst defeat that Austria had experienced since the Hungarian Revolution. More importantly, Italy had shown the world that Austrian power could be successfully challenged. It was not clear what would stop the Hungarians from trying their hand again, to say nothing of the Czechs, the Poles, or the Ukrainians. Something would have to change. We'll find out what these changes consisted of in the next episode. Thanks for listening.